Under the reign of Emperor Nero, the Roman Empire was not just ruled, it was consumed. Power no longer radiated from Rome's marble halls. It festered behind silk curtains, whispered through poison goblets, and clung to the breathless silence of the imperial palace. Rome had seen madmen, tyrants, and monsters, but none like Nero, who sang on a stage as the city burned, who killed his mother, who beat his pregnant wife to death with a kick, and then tried to bring her back. Her name was Poppaea Sabina. Her beauty was said to silence entire banquets. Her ambition helped her climb from noblewoman to empress. But Nero's obsession with her didn't end with her death. He refused to cremate her, as Roman custom demanded. He embalmed her body instead, dressed her as a goddess, and continued to speak to her as if she were still alive. And then he found a boy. The boy's name was Sporus. He was just a teenager no older than 15, a slave by birth, freed only to be transformed. His resemblance to Poppaea was haunting the same delicate jawline, the same haunting eyes. For Nero, that was enough to mutilate, enough to dress in a bridal gown, enough to stand before the empire and marry him. Yes, marry him. In 67 A.D., as Roman senators sat frozen in disbelief, Emperor Nero walked down the marble aisle of his private palace, adorned in gold, beside a boy forced into the role of empress. Sporus wore the veil. The crowd dared not laugh. To defy Nero was to die. From that day on, Sporus became Poppaea in name, in appearance, in every echo of her memory. He lived not as himself, but as a ghost fashioned to soothe the mind of a man spiraling into madness. He was paraded through cities as a living relic, presented to kings and poets, forced to smile through humiliation so profound it cracked the very soul of Roman dignity. No songs were written for Sporus, no statues erected, no rites afforded. He was an echo trapped in a broken shell, made to live out the dreams of a man who had murdered the original dream. And when Nero fell, when daggers closed in and the empire turned, Sporus did not find freedom. He became the trophy of each new tyrant, passed hand to hand like a cursed jewel, worn not with pride, but with cruelty. Until one day, the boy who had been made empress, made myth, chose the only act of rebellion left to him, silence, permanent, deliberate, final. You may remember Nero for his fire, his theater, his madness, but history forgets the face behind the veil, the boy who bled to become an empress, the wedding Rome tried to erase, and the scream that was never allowed to escape. He was only 16 when he took the throne. Nero, born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the last in the Julio-Claudian line, an emperor groomed for greatness. Rome had high hopes. He spoke poetry, played the lyre, and promised an age of golden renewal. But beneath the surface of youth and promise, there was a hunger too large to satisfy. The Senate saw it in flashes. His mother, Agrippina, saw it in full. She had installed him, after all, maneuvering every betrayal to put him on the throne, but even she misjudged how quickly the boy would shed his leash. By 21, Nero had orchestrated her murder. It started subtly. He stripped her guards, reassigned her advisors. He built a pleasure palace and filled it with actors, slaves, and indulgences. Agrippina's influence faded, her name spoken less in court, her presence more a reminder than a warning. When political pressure failed to keep her silent, Nero tried poison. When that didn't work, he rigged a boat to collapse beneath her while sailing. She swam ashore. Finally, he sent assassins to stab her in her villa. The story goes she offered her womb first, telling the killer to strike where Nero was born. It was the last act of a woman who raised a god and died by his hand. From there were no more boundaries. Nero married Octavia, the daughter of Emperor Claudius. It was a political union, cold and empty. He accused her of infertility, then adultery. She was banished, and soon after, executed. Her head was presented to Nero's new mistress, Poppaea Sabina, as a wedding gift. Poppaea was not just beautiful, she was intoxicating. Formerly married to a military commander, she rose through Roman society with grace and precision, charming both senators and generals. To Nero, she was perfection. He showered her with jewels, gave her imperial titles, and elevated her to empress. But what began as devotion quickly curdled into domination. He isolated her from the court, assigned servants to spy on her movements. He demanded loyalty, not just to him, but to the version of himself he believed she loved: an artist, a god, a man above reproach. When she became pregnant, Nero was elated. He imagined a dynasty reborn in her image. But one evening, during an argument, accounts vary on what was said. He struck her, a single kick to her abdomen. She collapsed. The unborn child died with her. The empire froze. For the first time, the Roman elite saw their emperor not as flamboyant or erratic, but unhinged. Nero, however, refused to mourn. He commanded her body be embalmed, dressed in royal regalia, entombed as a deity. Priests were summoned not to bless her passing, but to officiate her divinization. For weeks, he spoke to her corpse. He refused to eat unless food was placed before both their chairs. At public ceremonies, he reserved a seat for her, whispering to it as if she were still alive. And then, the search began. Somewhere in the imperial household, someone whispered of a boy, a teenager, pale-skinned, narrow-shouldered, with soft, melancholy eyes and the same high cheekbones. He resembled Poppaea, not in body, but in essence, and in the mind of a man fractured by grief and rotted by absolute power. That was enough. That boy's name was Sporus. He didn't ask for any of it. He was a freedman of the imperial household, likely a former slave, possibly born in servitude. We don't know who first noticed him. We only know that once Nero did, he became fixated. He called the palace physicians. He ordered the procedure. There were no words for it in Roman law, no precedent. What happened was not medicine, it was mutilation, an operation designed to erase identity, not restore it. Sporus was castrated, renamed, clothed in the silks of a dead woman, and taught to walk in her footsteps. To Nero, he wasn't Sporus anymore. He was Poppaea, reborn. The transformation of Sporus was not symbolic. It was surgical. There was no ceremony, no consent, no explanation, only orders carried out in silence. His name was stripped first. Nero commanded that he be called Sabina, the name Poppaea had carried in life. The rest followed: the garments, the voice coaching, the long hours of preparation under the eyes of stylists and attendants who had once served the real empress. They pinned his hair back in imperial curls. They pressed kohl around his eyes, powdered his cheeks, taught him to glide rather than walk. He was trained to respond to the name Poppaea, to smile when greeted, to bow at the precise angle she once had. Any deviation was corrected. Repetition became ritual, ritual became performance, performance became survival. The palace never publicly acknowledged what had happened. There were no proclamations, no debate in the Senate, but behind the golden doors of Domus Aurea, Nero rehearsed his new narrative. Sporus was not a replacement, he was a restoration. The body had changed, yes, but the spirit Nero insisted remained intact. He spoke to Sporus in the same language he had used with Poppaea. He shared memories they had never lived. He touched him with the same possessiveness, the same hunger, the same violence held just beneath the surface of affection. Sporus had no say, no refuge, no audience. The palace watched, and the palace obeyed. Then came the wedding. It was spring, 67 AD. The sun hung high above the Palatine Hill. Nero declared a feast in the imperial garden, inviting nobles, dignitaries, and foreign guests. Sporus was dressed in bridal white. His veil was stitched with pearls. Musicians played lyres and flutes as flower petals rained from the balconies. The emperor wore ceremonial robes, woven with gold thread and purple trim colors reserved only for gods and Caesars. Before the altar, Nero took Sporus's hand and declared him his wife, not his consort, not his concubine, his wife. Priests presided, vows were spoken, wine was poured. The crowd applauded, not out of joy, but survival. After the ceremony, Sporus was moved into the empress's quarters. the same suite Poppaea had once occupied. Every cushion, every vase, every drape had been returned to its original placement. Even her perfumes preserved in crystal were laid out as if waiting for her return. Sporus slept in her bed, ate from her dishes, sat at her mirror. Each morning began with attendants brushing out his hair. Each evening ended with Nero reciting poetry beside him, as if she were merely tired, not dead. But it was not just within the palace that the performance continued. Nero took Sporus to public events. At theater festivals, Sporus appeared beside him, draped in royal silks, his posture trained to mirror Poppaea's grace. At gladiator games, they sat side by side, surrounded by cheers and blood. In processions through Rome, Sporus rode in the imperial chariot, his hand raised in blessing, a veil shielding his face from the sun and from the gaze of those who knew. Among the people, there was confusion, then disgust, then fear. Some whispered that Nero had lost his mind. Others warned that to speak ill of the emperor's bride was treason. But Sporus had no such privilege. He could not whisper. He could not warn. His identity had been legislated out of existence. He no longer belonged to himself. He belonged to the story Nero told, and that story demanded he never break character. Behind closed doors, the strain began to show. Witnesses wrote of how Sporus would stare at his reflection for hours, how he flinched at sudden noises, how he grew thinner with each passing week, no matter the abundance laid before him. At times, Nero would lose patience. He would scold Sporus for failing to smile properly, for walking too heavily, for forgetting a shared memory that had never belonged to him. And each time, Sporus would bow, apologize, and adjust. He knew the price of imperfection. What Nero had created was not a companion, nor a queen, but a monument to grief carved from the body of a child. Sporus had become a mirror, one that reflected nothing of himself. And each day that passed, the image he had once known the boy he had been faded a little more, replaced by silk, silence, and the unbearable weight of pretending to be someone else. In the months that followed the imperial wedding, Nero's obsession only deepened. What began as imitation spiraled into ritualized madness. Every corner of the palace bore Poppaea's memory, and in each one, Sporus was expected to fit perfectly like a living puzzle piece forced into a frame that was never made for him. Nero commissioned new portraits, not of the empress as she had been, but of Sporus painted in her likeness, the same pose, the same gaze, the same crown balanced on a head that had never asked to wear it. Sculptors were instructed to blend her features with his. Poets were paid to compose verses praising her return. The fiction hardened into dogma. Outside the palace, Rome murmured. Senators grew uneasy. Generals whispered of insurrection. But inside Nero's world, the pageantry never stopped. He took Sporus to the theater in Corinth, where he performed before adoring Greek audiences as both ruler and artist. Between performances, he paraded Sporus before foreign dignitaries, introducing him not as a consort, but as the Empress of Rome. Some laughed behind closed doors. Others froze in disbelief. A few, out of fear or ambition, played along. The boy in the veil, the child empress, had become a symbol not of rebirth, but of imperial decay. Still, the illusion persisted. Sporus was coached in diplomacy. He dined with ambassadors. He received envoys. At Nero's side, he became an ornament of power, a testament to the emperor's authority to rewrite reality itself. The few who dared object were dealt with swiftly. One senator, who jested too loudly at a banquet, was ordered to kill himself. Another, who refused to address Sporus as Augusta, disappeared from public life altogether. Nero's grip on Rome was no longer political. It was psychological. Through Sporus, he held the empire hostage to a dream no one could wake from. But inside that dream, Sporus was breaking. Every day brought a new layer of performance, a new version of Poppaea to embody, a new expectation to fulfill. He could no longer recall the sound of his own name, the way his voice had once sounded when it was only his. Servants began to speak of his silence, how he rarely spoke, how his laughter had vanished. They whispered of nights when he would sit motionless by the fountain, staring into the water as if searching for someone who had drowned. They began to pity him, but quietly. Even pity, in Nero's Rome, was dangerous. Then came the signs that Nero's empire was unraveling. In 68 A.D., rebellion erupted in Gaul. Governors in the western provinces declared loyalty to the Senate, not the emperor. Rome's treasury was nearly empty, bled dry by Nero's extravagance. Soldiers began to defect. Generals began to conspire. Panic swept through the court. Nero, in desperation, turned again to performance. He imagined a final tour of the East, a triumphant circuit through Greece and Egypt, where he would sing and recite and dazzle the world into forgetting the empire was collapsing beneath his feet. Sporus, of course, would go with him. They left Rome not as rulers, but as fugitives in denial. Nero packed stages instead of swords. He sought applause where he should have commanded loyalty. Sporus rode beside him, a pale figure draped in lavender silk, his expression unreadable, his presence still mistaken for Poppaea's in cities where news traveled slowly. But no ovation could silence what was coming. Back in Rome, the Senate declared Nero an enemy of the state. The Praetorian Guard, once his protectors, turned against him. By the time the emperor realized he had no allies left, there was nowhere to run. Hunted and humiliated, Nero fled to a villa outside the city with a handful of loyalists, including Sporus. Cornered by the reality he had denied for so long, Nero refused capture. On June 9th, 68 A.D., he pressed a dagger to his throat and ordered a servant to finish the job. His last words, reportedly, were, "What an artist dies in me." The emperor was gone, but Sporus remained. In the immediate aftermath, there was no freedom, no release, only a shift in ownership. Sporus, still dressed in imperial garments, was taken in by Nymphidius Sabinus, a commander of the guard who declared himself emperor in the chaos. He paraded Sporus as his betrothed. When Nymphidius fell, Sporus passed into the hands of Otho, who had once been married to the real Poppaea. Even he addressed Sporus as if she had returned. Then came Vitellius, whose cruelty would eclipse them all. Each new master saw in Sporus not a person, but a relic, a token, a tool. The boy once forced to play empress now found himself trapped in a role that had outlived its purpose yet refused to die. Under Emperor Vitellius, the theater of cruelty resumed with new vigor. The civil war that followed Nero's death had not restored order. It had shattered what little was left of imperial dignity. Power passed from general to general like a drunken wager, and in this climate of vengeance and spectacle, Sporus became something more grotesque than a puppet. He was now a symbol of the empire's moral decay, paraded not in silence, but as entertainment. Vitellius had no interest in preserving the illusion Nero had so obsessively crafted. He saw in Sporus not an empress, but a novelty, a curiosity to be exploited. The boy who had once dined beside emperors was now forced to appear in public displays that blurred the line between satire and torture. His title was not rescinded. Instead, it was mocked. He was still addressed as Poppaea, still ordered to dress in ceremonial robes, but now only for the cruel amusement of audiences who jeered instead of bowed. No longer protected by the madness of a single man, Sporus found himself at the mercy of a mob. It was during this time that Vitellius planned his most perverse spectacle, a public performance in the arena, Rome's greatest stage where Sporus would be forced to reenact the myth of Proserpina, the goddess abducted and violated by the god of the underworld. But this was not a metaphor. It was a sentence, a staging of divine rape, cast not with actors, but with real flesh, orchestrated to titillate a crowd starving for distraction. Sporus was to appear in the arena in bridal costume, dragged in chains before a costumed assailant. His suffering passed off as ritual. The cruelty was precise. It was meant not to kill, but to destroy what dignity remained. When word reached Sporus of what awaited him, there was no rebellion, no attempt to run, no plea for mercy. There was only the quiet decision to vanish on his own terms. He had endured the blades of surgeons, the hands of emperors, the sneers of senators, and the hunger of crowds. But what was to come was different. It was not survival he feared, it was the permanence of humiliation, the complete collapse of his self into spectacle. And so, before the day of the performance, he found poison. Whether given by a servant or acquired through allies is unknown. What matters is that he drank it. He died in silence, likely in a guest room, far from the arena where thousands had already gathered. The screams they expected never came. There was no blood on the sand, no broken body dragged across the stage, just an empty platform and a whisper that the Empress had died again. Sporus was gone. No eulogy was given. No monument was raised. His name vanished from the records until historians, centuries later, pieced together the fragments of his life. But even those fragments are filtered through the gaze of those who never saw him as human, only as a mirror of someone else, a reflection projected onto him by madmen and monsters. And yet, in the act of ending his own life, he did something no emperor had expected. He reclaimed himself, not in triumph, but in refusal. He had been reshaped, renamed, repurposed, but in the end, the final choice was his. And that silence, more than any scream, was the clearest declaration he ever made. History has a way of polishing its monsters and forgetting its ghosts. Nero is remembered in theater, in novels, in opera as a tyrant who fiddled while Rome burned. His name survives in satire and in sin. His madness is recited like a cautionary tale. But Sporus, the boy forced to wear a crown made of memory, was almost erased. He lingers not in marble statues or epic verses, but in marginal footnotes, a curiosity, a rumor, an anecdote mistaken for scandal. What remains are fragments, filtered through the pens of chroniclers who never asked who he had been before Nero touched his life. In those fragments, Sporus appears again and again under different names, dressed in costumes chosen by others, referenced only in relation to the powerful men who possessed him. He is never quoted. He leaves no letters. There are no personal testimonies. The boy's own voice was silenced so thoroughly that even time struggled to remember he had one. And yet, his presence remains traced in the uneasy silence that follows the stories told about him. Not a villain, not a hero, something harder to understand, a victim too inconvenient to glorify, too human to turn into myth. He was not the first to be exploited by power, nor the last, but few endured such relentless erasure, physical, emotional, and historical. Sporus was molded to fit someone else's grief, someone else's obsession. His identity was rewritten as a fantasy. His body became the canvas for someone else's mourning. Even in death, he was not mourned as himself, but as the final collapse of a dangerous illusion. What made his story exceptional was not its brutality. Rome was built on brutality. It was the silence that followed it, the silence of a city that watched and did nothing, the silence of historians who called him a mock wife, a freak, a cautionary joke, the silence of memory itself. And yet, beneath that silence, there is resistance. In the act of ending his own life, Sporus did what no one else had allowed him to do. He acted on his own terms. He refused to be rewritten one final time. In a world that had taken everything, including his name, he reclaimed his end, not as a bride, not as a puppet, not as Poppaea, but as himself, however distant, however fractured that self had become. That act did not restore what was lost, but it interrupted the performance. Perhaps that's why his story still haunts, not because of what was done to him, but because of what was never undone. He was a life lived entirely inside the shadow of someone else's desire, a name barely spoken aloud, a face painted over, a tragedy buried beneath the stories of emperors and gods. But if memory is resistance, then remembering him now, truly remembering, without mockery or myth, is an act of defiance. There are no victories in this story, no redemptions, only the echo of a boy who outlived a tyrant, and then chose to vanish before the world could consume him again. In that vanishing, he became something Nero could never be: honest, vulnerable, human. And it is that humanity, not the costume, not the crown, that Rome tried hardest to forget. Some stories survive because they were sung, others because they were screamed. Sporus' story endured because someone whispered it, too strange to be believed, too brutal to be entirely forgotten. The boy who became a bride, the empress without a past, the ornament of a collapsing empire, he flickers through history not as a symbol of power, but as a reflection of everything power can destroy. He had no legacy carved in stone, no heirs, no empire to fall with him, but in the silence he left behind, a deeper truth lingers. What happened to Sporus was not an accident of madness. It was the logical end of unchecked power, of grief unrestrained by reason, of a world where beauty and obedience were currency traded at the cost of personhood. He was never allowed to grow old, never allowed to become ordinary. His life was suspended in a moment that was never his to choose. And yet, the weight of his silence outlasted the empire that tried to consume him. He is not remembered because he ruled, he is remembered because he endured, because even in the absence of his own voice, the echo of what was taken from him refuses to disappear completely. And perhaps that is all that remains of justice in this story, not in the fall of Nero, not in the collapse of Rome, but in the lingering discomfort of a name history tried not to say. Sporus. He lived. He was watched. He was made into something he never asked to be. And still, he chose when it would end. That choice, that final act, was not a cry for pity. It was a rejection of the stage, of the costume, of the lie. And it leaves us with a question that history never answered. Not what Nero did, but what Rome allowed. Not who Sporus was made to become, but who he might have been, if anyone had asked.